Very recently, a certain YouTuber by the name of Mr. Not Actually a Professor Dave decided to make yet another one of his takedown videos. This is very much unsurprising, as Mr. Dave is a guy whose entire career is built upon using insults and slander to generate drama, which then translates into revenue for his channel, while he otherwise attempts to masquerade himself as an actual science journalist. In his most recent efforts to drum up a sense of indignation and self-superiority within his audience, Dave has taken aim at a certain Christopher Langan. Chris Langan is an autodidact who made a name for himself as the creator of a metaphysical cosmography, which he refers to as the CTMU, the cognitive theoretic model of the universe. Langan has also made many headlines as the guy with a 200 IQ score, though this is by far the least interesting and least consequential aspect of this story. This video isn't going to waste too much breath on Mr. Dave's takedown itself, because ultimately Dave really just doesn't have anything interesting to say, as usual. It's abundantly clear that Dave has put no effort whatsoever into understanding what Langan's CTMU actually is, and as such, Dave fails to say anything whatsoever about the actual contents of Langan's thought, and certainly fails to present anything even remotely resembling a well-composed critique. Instead, Dave's video is exactly what one would expect. Dave's entire video focuses on a single interview of Chris Langan with the journalist Michael Knowles, an interview in which Langan is attempting to explain his CTMU in the most rudimentary terms possible to a man who, much like Dave, knows absolutely nothing about the history or philosophy of science, let alone the metaphysical roots of modern science, which extend well into the depths of antiquity. Dave clips out certain phrases from their context and proceeds to hurl insults at Langan, while failing to say anything at all about Langan's actual ideas over the course of his 77-minute takedown. As such, there is very little in the way of actual argumentation here which I could meaningfully comment upon, but Dave does make at least one philosophical claim in his video, one which has much broader implications than might initially be apparent. Langan has described his CTMU as a metatheoretical language, a phrase which Langan explicitly indicates is equivalent to the notion of a metaphysical framework. On this point, Dave actually gets brave enough to step outside of his comfort zone and say something concrete. Dave proclaims that Langan clearly doesn't know what he is talking about because theories are not languages. Rather, Dave tells us theories are simply models. This might initially seem to be a rather inconsequential bickering over terminology, but as we shall see, this disagreement in fact illustrates the inner workings of Dave's own ideological allegiances. By unfolding the implications we find here, we can better understand why Dave actually cannot meaningfully engage with Langan's ideas, and we can also begin to illustrate what Langan's CTMU actually is and what its implications actually amount to. This video will consist of two parts. In part 1, we are going to look at the aforementioned distinction between models and theories. We will examine in detail the epistemological implications of such a distinction and what this distinction, or the lack thereof, indicates in regards to our understanding of scientific veracity and the relationship between science and the broader philosophical fields of ontology and philosophy of mind. In the second part, we will begin looking at Chris Langan's CTMU itself, and begin to unpack exactly what the CTMU is, what it is intended to achieve, and how the theory stands in relation to fields of science, such as quantum field theory and Einsteinian relativistic theories. A scientific model is a construct which is expressed in terms which are native to a given scientific discipline. Newton's first law of motion is a very straightforward example of this. F equals ma is a model. More specifically, it is a linguistic construct. In order for this equation to actually mean anything at all, let alone express epistemological value, it must be expressed by terms which are actually well defined, and these terms must be related to one another and to the world in intelligible ways. These definitions and relational aspects aren't simply given. They depend upon a much broader background of assumptions. Newton's first law is a description of inertia. It tells us that the amount of matter, or mass, is directly related to the resistance of that mass to changes in its velocity. This might seem like a rather intuitive or even obvious insight to the modern mind. A tiny ball rolling down a hill is going to be much more easily stopped than one the size of a car. But even if Newton's model might seem like an expression of something obvious to us, we must keep in mind the brute fact that, for whatever reason, this was simply not obvious before Newton's formulations. In order for Newtonian ideas to solidify within modern consciousness such that they might come to seem obvious, an act of radically imaginative insight was required. In fact, if we begin to look more closely at Newton's formulation, this illusion of obviousness begins to rapidly melt away. Why is Newton implying that force is related to the acceleration of an object and not its velocity? If a giant boulder is rolling down a hill, what difference does it make whether the speed of the boulder is changing or not? In reality, Newton is actually saying something quite different and far more subtle than what our intuitions might initially indicate. Newton's most radical insight, which upon closer inspection we find implicated throughout all of Newton's laws of motion, is that fixed velocities are actually states of rest. Looking at the natural world around us, this would seem not only counterintuitive, but empirically false. Moving bodies lose momentum over time and become stationary. How could we possibly conclude that stationary objects and objects moving with fixed velocities are actually both effectively at rest? In order for Newtonian physics to even be intelligible at all, let alone empirically substantiated, we need to drastically reconfigure our intuitive understanding of some of the most basic conceptual contents of our thought. Specifically, we need to be able to fundamentally reconceptualize our understandings of space and motion in a relativistic, perspectival manner. We can see the germs of what would eventually become Newtonian mechanics in Galilean relativity. Galileo tells us to imagine that we are below the deck of a ship. The waters are perfectly stable, and so we are unable to discern whether the ship is stationary relative to the Earth or if it is moving at a fixed velocity. If we toss a ball straight up into the air, it will come straight back down, regardless as to whether the ship is stationary or moving at a fixed velocity. What this points us towards is the notion that the universe is governed by mathematical constants which are invariant in relation to perspectival frames of reference. Standing on the shore, you will see my ship as moving, but as long as my velocity is fixed, the laws of physics will operate as though I were at rest, because each perspectival reference defines its own resting state. Newton would then further generalize this notion by fully relativizing kinematics itself, such that fixed velocities are regarded as identical to stationary resting states within their own perspectival reference frames. For those of you who have been following my channel for a while, the significance of this perspectival mode of thinking will be much more apparent. The capacity to relativize kinematics in this way was not simply a stroke of genius on the part of Galileo or Isaac Newton. This mode of thinking simply was not available to the Romans or ancient Greeks because a number of historical developments of Western consciousness itself needed to occur in order to lay the groundwork for the possibility of such models. Within classical philosophy, the earthly domain was regarded as ontologically distinct from the celestial world above us. The natural world was regarded as one of transience, decay, imperfection, and particularity, while the heavens above were regarded as a realm of eternality, perfection, and universality. Philosophical naturalism was a field of inquiry which effectively ended at the firmament. Within traditional Platonic and Aristotelian cosmology, it would have seemed utterly absurd to suggest that the same principles at work within the earthly realm also governed the transcendental realm above us. And yet, by the time of Galileo, the Neoplatonic cosmology of Christendom had already begun to shift in radical ways. During the 13th century, medieval scholastic philosophers had introduced the notion of nominalism. Nominalism represented a radical break from Neoplatonic cosmology in that it argued against the independent reality of forms, and instead proposed that universal concepts are simply categories, which are only meaningful insofar as they encompass particular entities within the natural world. Within the perspectival art forms of the Renaissance period, we see the emergence of a form of collective consciousness which had begun to place a central significance upon human subjectivity, effectively elevating the particularity of individual human experience to the level of a universal category in a manner which would have been seen as utterly alien within the Neoplatonic mode of antiquity. This perspectival shift, which we have examined in far more detail in previous videos, also began to facilitate the emergence of several notions which would prove to be absolutely fundamental to the embryonic philosophical naturalism which would eventually become modern science. The subjectivization of Renaissance art and Cartesian metaphysics would translate into notions of perspectival relativity and interchangeability. Notions which would be absolutely necessary backgrounds for the scientific notion of physical laws as invariable constants. The works of Galileo and Kepler in particular would facilitate the rupturing of the firmament's inviolable boundaries, as such thinkers advocated for the notion that celestial bodies were actually included within the natural world. Galileo revealed that the blotches we see on the moon are in fact craters, physical imperfections which would have been considered to be properties of the terrestrial realm but not the celestial. Similarly, Kepler would advocate for a planetary model based on elliptical orbits. Within Neoplatonic cosmology, ellipses were regarded as more deformed or impure than circular orbits, and as such it was assumed that only circular motions could be properties of the celestial domain of transcendental perfection. Kepler's work therefore further facilitated a departure from traditional cosmologies and further reinforced the notion that the astronomical realm was continuous with the natural world rather than being ontologically separated from it. The imaginative genius of Isaac Newton was in his realization that this project of naturalizing the astronomical could be completed through the relativization of kinematics. Further elaborating upon Galilean relativity, Newton came to reconceptualize the notion of rest in such a manner that rest was now defined as an absence of acceleration rather than an absence of velocity. In doing so, Newton could then regard celestial bodies as attempting to move in straight lines at fixed velocities, as he inferred that such fixed straight-line motions should be the natural resting states of bodies which are not being acted upon by other forces such as friction. Newton then inferred that gravity, the very same force which pulls objects to the ground here on Earth, could be at work in bending the straight-line resting trajectories of celestial objects into elliptical orbits. Newton's mathematical formulations were not simply quantitative descriptions of empirical observations. They represented the consummation of a radical metamorphosis of the basic conceptual contents of the Western cosmological worldview. The traditional Platonic conception of transcendental form and immanent appearance was transmuted into a more modern metaphysical framework within which the transcendental realm was now regarded as one of mathematical laws which governed the world of sensory observations. In order to complete this transformation, Newton needed to abstract from his own empirical experiences in a way that might seem deeply unnatural. In the world around us, we do not actually see objects staying in motion until acted upon by external forces. Objects seem to need energy to move, and the natural resting state of any solid body would seem to be one of motionless stasis. Newton needed to use his imagination to abstract bodies from the forces of gravity and friction which act upon them, so as to envision how they might operate in an ideal state which we do not actually observe in the natural world around us. This narrative is significant here in that it illustrates the way in which scientific developments are not simply a matter of devising models and comparing them to empirical observations. At a much more fundamental level, changes in science are facilitated by transformations of the conceptual languages which scientific models are posited within. Newton's insights were not necessarily facilitated by empirical observations which were not available to the ancient Greeks. More fundamentally, they were conditioned by much more abstract developments of the European world picture, which had taken place over the course of at least 5 centuries, and which were directly related to the influences of theology, alchemy, and cultural osmosis. These deeper dynamics of human thought tend to be almost entirely ignored within popular science media and textbooks, as the history of science itself has come to be mythologized into something much more sterile and procedural than the story which has actually unfolded. When we are taught the history of heliocentric cosmology, for example, we tend to be presented with a narrative which frames figures such as Copernicus and Galileo as rebellious seekers of truth who are being oppressed by the dogmatic and authoritarian forces of Roman Catholicism, and who are ultimately vindicated by the divine light of no-nonsense procedural rationality. The truth, unsurprisingly, is much more complicated. If we look to traditional Neoplatonic cosmology, we find that the Sun was in fact the center of the solar system, but in a rather different manner than what we find in modern scientific models. The Neoplatonic solar system was conceptualized through a language of transcendental universality and immanent particularity, not of strictly naturalistic gravitational mechanics. The Earth was not so much considered the center of the universe, but rather more as the bottom of a descending chain of emanation through which pure and simple universal forms came to merge together so as to eventually generate the complex particulars of the terrestrial domain. At the highest level, we find the sphere of fixed stars, the pinholes, as it were, through which the light of the Empyrean's eternal fires are projected into the world of becoming. The Sun then represented the midway point between the terrestrial and transcendental domains, as it was considered to be a kind of mediator between the two poles of Neoplatonic cosmology. Copernicus, in keeping with his own Platonic heritage, also held to the notion that the celestial realm must be one of perfection, and thus maintain the necessity of perfectly circular orbits within his heliocentric model. Copernicus was not motivated by the notion that the Sun exerted more gravitational influence than the Earth. Copernicus devised his heliocentric cosmology well over a century before Newton would suggest that the motions of celestial bodies are determined by gravity. Nor was Copernicus compelled by empirical observation. Due to the fact that the Copernican model retained circular orbits, it in fact made less accurate empirical predictions than the Ptolemaic model, and would continue to fail empirically until Kepler's introduction of elliptical orbits over half a century later. If we are looking at the Copernican revolution through the lens of simplistic empirical falsification, then it would seem that Copernicus and his followers were all complete crackpots who were willing to completely ignore empirical evidence in favor of their eccentric pet theory. In reality, what we are seeing here is something much more nuanced. The Ptolemaic model accounted for retrograde motion of planetary bodies through the notion of epicycles. The planets followed circular paths, but these circles were then complexified by additional circles, which accounted for the wandering paths of the planets. What Copernicus came to see was that these retrograde motions could also be accounted for through consideration of our own perspectival reference frame here on Earth. If the Earth is also moving in relation to other celestial objects, then we would perceive the planetary bodies to be seemingly changing directions. As we can see, the Copernican insight was directly continuous with the more general process of subjectivization, which we also see within Renaissance art, Galilean relativity, and the Cartesian cogito ergo sum. Through the relativization of the Earth's perspective, Copernicus saw the possibility of a much more parsimonious solar system, which could do away with epicycles by resituating the Sun as the center of orbital motion rather than as the center of mediation between transcendence and immanence. Not because of empirical predictions, but rather in spite of empirical falsification, scientists of the Renaissance and early modern periods continued to pursue the possibility presented by Copernicus, as it was a central piece in their quest to render the astronomical world intelligible to naturalistic investigation. Of course, we might presume that in spite of this metaphysical complexity, that it was in fact empirical observation that had the final say in the matter. That at some point along the way, the Copernican model was able to make accurate predictions which the Ptolemaic model could not make, and thus the Ptolemaic model would come to be relegated to the trash bin of discredited and antiquated conceptual maps. But here again, we find that this is simply not the case. Since the advent of Einsteinian relativity, science has held that there is no absolute space or absolute motion. Einstein further universalized Galilean and Newtonian relativity by completely erasing Newton's notion of an absolute spatial background and the 19th century notion of the luminiferous etheric medium. As such, this implies that there is no difference at all between a resting trajectory and a motionless stasis. If we have two bodies orbiting one another in space, then we can conceptualize either body as holding still and the other one as moving around it. If you're standing on one of the two bodies, then you will appear to be the one not moving because, from your perspectival vantage point, you will in fact be at rest. Someone standing on the other body, however, will see you as in motion relative to them, and the fact of the matter here is that there simply is no fact of the matter. Both observers are just as correct and just as wrong. As such, there is no real, ontological sense in which we can say that the sun is holding still and the earth is moving. Our models depict the solar system as though the sun were the body which is truly at rest, but there is absolutely nothing empirical which could prevent us from returning to a revised geocentric model if we decided to depict the earth as though it were the stationary body. Such a revised geocentric model would make the exact same empirical predictions as the modern heliocentric model, and we needn't make any adjustments to any physical laws in order to make this happen. You could argue that placing the sun at the center is more sensible because the sun is the larger, more massive body, and thus it is more parsimonious to pretend that the sun is stationary and that the earth is in motion. That may indeed be a sensible argument, but we have to acknowledge here that this is also a value judgment. It is an assertion about what properties should be privileged within our models, about what aspects of the world truly matter to us, not about the empirical efficacy or falsifiability of the model. Maps are not territories, and a single territory can accommodate a variety of maps. As such, the maps we prefer often tell us as much about ourselves and the conceptual contents of our collective awareness as they tell us about the empirical contents of the natural world. Those maps depend upon the conceptual structures, or rather languages, which underlie them. The limits of our thinking are bound inasmuch as we confine ourselves to the conceptual frameworks which we operate within, and unbound insofar as we are able to turn the microscope around, as it were, and scrutinize the conceptual building blocks of our own thought, in addition to our examinations of the natural world. By bringing attention to the metaphysical and conceptual nature of scientific inquiry, we aren't exactly dealing with a dark, mysterious, and novel insight. Throughout the vast majority of scientific history, the dependence of science upon metaphysics, ontology, and epistemology was widely recognized. Natural philosophy, as the name implies, was regarded as a branch of philosophy, not as something which could exist independently of philosophy. The attempts to quarantine science away from philosophy as a whole, and thus pretend that the conceptual contents of science are simply obvious, is a very recent endeavor, one which we can trace back to the 20th century philosopher of science, Karl Popper. Popper's thought would come to lay the groundwork for the tumorous growth of scientism, which would eventually come to metastasize throughout academic institutions in the wake of the Second World War. Popper would sow the seeds of the dogmatism, which we see in figures like Mr. Dave, and which results in the intentional obfuscation of the relationship between science and metaphysics. Popper saw his primary target as the so-called problem of induction, an epistemological notion which we can trace back to the 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume. Hume, a British empiricist, held that all of the contents of the human mind originated in sensory observations and, most significantly, presumed that empirical experience consisted entirely of sensory experiences alone. As a descendant of the 13th century nominalist break with Neoplatonic realism, Hume further presumed that the conceptual contents of thought were merely generalizations, that ideas or concepts were merely linguistic categories, which were used by the human mind to organize sensory observations. As such, Hume concluded that there were in fact two types of knowledge, and this bifurcation would later become known as Hume's fork. On the one hand, Hume tells us that there are matters of fact. These are sensory observations of the natural world. On the other hand, there are relations of ideas, a priori knowledge, which derives from the logical contents of concepts in themselves. If I state that there are no married bachelors, then this is a purely a priori truth, which derives from the definitions of the terms married and bachelor. It tells me about the relations of ideas, but nothing about the empirical contents of the world. Hume's fork, however, would create an immense and seemingly insurmountable problem within epistemological naturalism. If we can only discern matters of fact through sensory observations, then how could we ever generalize our observations so as to arrive at natural laws? No one has ever seen or touched a physical law. We must infer the existence of such regularities through generalization. I can state that every swan I've ever encountered has been white, but in order to claim that all swans are white, I need to posit the existence of some compositional feature of nature which necessitates that regularity. The problem here is that my sensory organs never make contact with such compositional elements. If I can't justify the claim that all swans are white, then I also cannot conclude that the sun will rise tomorrow simply because it has risen every day previously. I cannot justify the claim that electromagnetism will accord with my equations tomorrow simply because it has done so every day previously. No amount of sensory observation will transform a generalization into a justified universal claim. It might seem outlandish to think that the regularities of nature could simply change on a dime, and this is indeed an absurdity. But within such a human epistemological framework, we are left with nothing which can allow us to distinguish between justified universals and unjustified generalizations. That is, unless, of course, we abandon Hume's nominalist anti-realism and begin to consider the possibility that human experience consists of more than merely sensorial contents. That, however, would certainly blur the lines between scientific epistemology and the realms of metaphysics, phenomenology, and philosophy of mind. As previously noted, such boundaries have always been blurry, if not entirely non-existent, throughout the vast majority of scientific history. Karl Popper, however, dedicated himself to a different sort of solution to Hume's problem of induction, one which would seemingly allow science to thoroughly amputate itself from philosophy as a whole. Within his 1959 text, The Logic of Scientific Discovery, Popper attempts to divorce scientific epistemology from metaphysics by completely excising inductive reasoning itself. Following Hume, Popper concludes that because inductive generalizations cannot be rationally justified by either sensory observations or logical inferences, that scientific epistemology must somehow be entirely deductive. Scientific investigation requires the conjecturing of universal claims, but how could it be that such claims could be seen as deductively valid if they are claims about matters of fact and not relations of ideas? In other words, how could we ever prove that all swans are white or that the sun will continue to rise using only logic? The answer, quite obviously, is that we cannot. Popper, however, points out that although we can never deductively justify the claim that all swans are white, we can definitively falsify such a claim. A single observation of a black swan can completely disprove such a generalization. Popper then argues that scientific epistemology operates in a purely negative manner. Science conjectures universal statements and then performs empirical investigations in an effort to disprove these conjectures. Less robust theories are discarded as they are falsified by conflicting empirical observations, and the theories which survive falsification are then presumed to be more robust. According to Popper, scientific logic therefore operates in a manner analogous to evolutionary natural selection. Just as natural selection acts as a kind of filter which sculpts organisms by removing deleterious genes from a population of organisms, empirical research serves to filter out scientific conjectures which are less viable. The genes which manage to perpetuate themselves in spite of natural selection produce organisms which are more fitted to their environments. And analogously, the theories which survive empirical falsification can be regarded as more epistemologically fit. Popper thus concludes that scientific hypotheses can never be said to be true in any positive sense. The best we can ever say is that a conjecture is less false than competing conjectures which have been discredited. Even the most robust theory will always stand in danger of being discarded due to a single falsifying observation. Popper admits that this line of reasoning precludes the possibility of any scientific hypothesis being a fact, as only specific sensory observations can truly be regarded as factual. Needless to say, Popper's biggest fans tend to be those who are most eager to sweep that point under the rug. Popper's falsificationism has proven to be immensely appealing to apologists and popularizers of science, as it seems to suggest that scientific epistemology is able to operate without the need for any sort of metaphysical, phenomenological, or ontological grounding whatsoever. Science can simply carry out its algorithmic procedures of conjecture and refutation without any concern for philosophy as a whole. If a conjecture is able to survive falsification, then scientists can regard the theory as being effectively true, as it has proven itself to be less false than its competitors. A model or hypothesis which has proven itself more robust can be treated as though it were true, even if it is completely devoid of ontological contents. For example, if scientists devise an equation which predicts the behavior of a certain chemical, and those predictions repeatedly survive attempts at falsification, then that model can be regarded as true, even if it makes no claims whatsoever about what processes are actually at work behind that regularity. In other words, there needn't be any actual understanding, or even an attempt to achieve understanding, of the actual reasons why nature operates in the way that it does. If the model makes predictions, then it can be regarded as a quasi-truth, even if it tells us nothing about what is actually occurring in the world. This attitude was particularly appealing to academic physics after the end of the Second World War for a number of reasons. Since even the days of Isaac Newton, physics had struggled with an internal tension between naturalistic empiricism and the need to conjecture an unseen world of hidden entities and forces. Newton himself famously stated that he did not even pretend to present a scientific hypothesis about the nature of gravity. Newton's equations were able to somewhat accurately model the behaviors of celestial objects, but his model doesn't provide us with any explanation of what gravity actually is or why it operates in the way that it does. In other words, the Newtonian theory of gravitation is not a scientific theory. It is merely a model, one which is entirely devoid of genuine theoretical contents, and Newton himself was well aware of this shortcoming. Within the Popperian falsificationist framework, however, this issue can simply be discarded, as there is no meaningful distinction between theories and models within such an epistemology. A model which is able to make accurate predictions is as true as a scientific conjecture can actually be, and ontological claims about what is actually happening in the real world can simply fall by the wayside, as post-war physics came to venture ever further into unseen worlds, and thus ever further away from grounding in concrete, empirical human experience of nature. This Popperian attitude came to be seen as ever more appealing. It was also during this time period that the epicenter of physics came to migrate from Germany to the United States. Academic science in the United States was far less interconnected with philosophy than had been the case in Germany. Moreover, this development occurred in the wake of the atomic bomb and the initiation of the Cold War. The United States federal government had thus come to see that physics was a source of immense military and geopolitical power and began to invest exorbitant amounts of funding into physics. The United States government was far more interested in prediction and control, and thus engineering applicability, than it was in genuinely understanding why the world actually operates as it does. Human beings tend to be much more inclined to believe what their wallets and careers suggest to them, and physics was certainly no exception to this. The militaristic fervor of the Cold War and the cutthroat opportunism of American venture capitalism were perfectly fertile ground for a Popperian philosophy of science, which effectively abandoned the scientific quest for genuine understanding of nature. From a Popperian falsificationist vantage point, it would indeed seem that there is no real distinction between models and theories. The truth of a scientific conjecture amounts to no more and no less than its ability to make falsifiable predictions which can survive falsification, even if that conjecture is nothing more than an equation which tells us absolutely nothing about how or why the universe actually happens to accord with the regularities which that equation attempts to model. Falsificationism effectively discards the scientific aspiration for genuine explanations in favor of an epistemology which instead concerns itself only with the power to predict and therefore control the natural world through mathematical precision. Some modern science apologists would argue that this is a distinction which makes no real difference, but the Popperian framework of scientific logic has a much less debatable chink in its armor. The fact that when we attempt to actually look at the history of science through this lens, it very quickly proves itself to be egregiously false. As we saw previously when examining the transition from Ptolemaic to Copernican models of our solar system, scientists do not, in fact, discard theories when they are falsified by conflicting data, even if there are competing theories which make more accurate predictions. Looking to modern science, we see, if anything, an even greater abundance of such examples. For nearly a century now, modern astronomy has been a castle built out of Einsteinian bricks. Virtually all astronomical models and inferences hinge upon the presumption that Einstein's formulations of special and general relativity are actually true, or at least true enough to justify their use as the bedrock of an entire scientific discipline. Throughout the entire lifetime of Einsteinian astronomy, however, general relativity has been consistently falsified by every single observation of galaxies and supergalactic formations. These celestial structures simply do not behave the way that they should if we are presuming that Einstein's theories are actually true. Rather than simply discarding relativity and attempting to devise a new theoretical language, astronomy has instead inferred that these conflicting observations are not evidence against the relativistic understanding of gravity, but instead are evidence for the existence of an unobservable dark matter. This dark matter is a term which is effectively meaningless. There are no empirically substantiated theories which predict its existence. No one can say what exactly this dark matter is, or why it has continued to elude observation even after untold billions have been spent on particle colliders which have also failed to detect any such entities. The point I'm making here is independent of whether Einstein was actually right, or even whether dark matter is ever shown to be something other than a fantasy. The point here is that science simply does not operate in the manner that falsificationism implies, and it never has. The reality is that epistemological considerations go far deeper than this very crude understanding can capture, as epistemology is always inexorably interwoven with conceptual, ontological, and even ideological dynamics. Apologists of modern astronomy will argue that even though our observations of galaxies clearly contradict the Einsteinian framework, we simply have no choice but to carry on and acting as though we are actually living within an Einsteinian spacetime because there are no other theories which we could replace the Einsteinian model with. This, however, is false. Modified Newtonian dynamics, or MOND models, have presented an alternative to dark matter since the 1980s, and there are many currents of evidence which seem to accord much better with MOND models than with dark matter models. Nonetheless, modern astronomy has almost completely ignored these MOND theories, not because MOND has been more falsified than dark matter, but simply because accepting modified Newtonian dynamics would require going back to the drawing board for essentially the entire field of astronomy. MOND models necessarily operate within a non-relativistic theoretical framework. If astronomy were to actually declare MOND the winner, it would necessarily have to declare Einstein the loser, and this would call into question almost every single inference, model, PhD thesis, and textbook which has been produced by astronomy over the course of nearly a century. Both of the examples I've just provided derive from the field of astronomy alone, and I could certainly create an entire series of videos by explicating examples from across various fields of science over the course of history. The point for now, however, is that when we look at the actual history of science and even contemporary scientific practices which often profess to operate within a Popperian methodology, we find that Karl Popper was simply wrong. Moreover, Karl Popper's epistemology, by his own admission, does not actually succeed in purging inductive reasoning from scientific practice, even if we are conceding that his framework is an aspirational ideal which real science has never actually accorded with. If I have an equation which has successfully survived falsification, then it isn't enough to say that the model is less false if I'm going to actually trust the model enough to act upon it. When we actually act upon a hypothesis as though it were true, we are not simply conceding that it has yet to be falsified. We are trusting that the model actually does accord with some sort of universal principles which ensure that nature will not spontaneously change its mind tomorrow morning. If we are actually following Popper's reasoning and concluding that inductive reasoning is categorically irrational, then that means we have no justification for believing that an unfalsified model will actually remain unfalsified. Presuming any sort of uniformity of nature necessarily requires us to make inductive leaps. If we were to actually do away with induction altogether, then we should conclude that we have no reason at all to believe that the entire order of nature will not spontaneously change. If this were to occur, then our unfalsified models would suddenly stop making accurate predictions, and the models which were falsified in the past might spontaneously begin to actually work. This seems like an absurd possibility because it is, but if we are taking Popper's logic seriously, this is in fact where it inevitably leads us. Popper himself did ultimately concede this point and stated that falsificationism still requires a hint of induction. By Popper's own reasoning, this would be a hint of completely unjustifiable irrationality, one which turns out to be an inexorable keystone that the very actionability of the entire scientific enterprise hinges upon. If we actually put Popperian falsificationism under the microscope, we find that it ultimately leaves us exactly where David Hume left us in the 18th century, with no way to actually rationalize the basic belief that the sun will actually rise tomorrow. When we look at science through a Popperian lens, it almost seems as though scientific progress itself is operating within a completely irrational manner. One of the primary reasons why astronomers are not very eager to abandon the Einsteinian relativistic framework is because Einstein's relativity is not simply a model. It is itself a theoretical language which provides a background of intelligibility within which inferences, models, and experimental programs can actually be formulated. In order to actually move beyond Einstein, or at the very least, expand upon Einstein's theories in a manner that actually brings them into accordance with empirical observations, astronomy would have to exercise a faculty which physical science in general came to abandon after the Second World War. Simply making conjectures and performing observations to corroborate them is not enough. In order to revise or formulate a theoretical language, scientists actually have to do metaphysics. They have to critically examine the most basic conceptual contents of their own theoretical paradigms through a mode of reasoning that scientists haven't been trained in since the early 20th century at the latest. Scientists would need to take seriously questions about what the most basic constituents of reality actually are, what the relationships are like between those basic constituents and human observation, and what sorts of inductive generalizations are actually justified by our understanding of what the basic compositional features of the world must be like. In other words, scientists would need to seriously re-examine our understandings of time, space, causality, and consciousness, topics which, since the advent of falsificationism, many scientists have regarded as beneath them, as purely conceptual squabbles which are better left to philosophers and their mind games, while scientists perform the more serious business of creating models and testing them. So this then brings us finally to Chris Langan and his cognitive theoretic model of the universe. As previously mentioned, Chris Langan is not an academic scientist or professional philosopher, but rather an autodidact who has, much like myself, dedicated much of his life to untangling the conceptual knots which he has found within our modern understanding of nature. Langan is admittedly a guy who can come across as rather arrogant and blunt at times, and this is probably a large part of why Mr. Dave decided that Langan would be an easy target for ridicule. I, however, don't particularly give half a damn about what Langan's personality is like, what his political views are, what his IQ score is, or whether he has any sort of academic credentials. If you're familiar with my channel at all, then you know that that is simply not how I roll, and as such, I'm not going to bother with any of Mr. Dave's embarrassingly juvenile attempts at defamation. This video is not about that. It's about attempting to understand something that someone like Mr. Dave will not bother to understand. Chris Langan's CTMU is not primarily a scientific model. It is not a system of mathematical equations which are intended to make specific predictions, at least not in and of itself. Rather, the CTMU is a meta-theory, or rather a cosmography. It is a conceptual language which intends to address the most basic ontological constituents of reality, the most elementary compositional features of the world which underlie space, time, causality, consciousness, and the very intelligibility of the cosmos at large. As with all forms of Western philosophy and science, we can best begin to understand Langan's CTMU by examining its relationship to the traditional Platonic cosmology. As we saw in more detail in previous videos, all of Western philosophy is, in some manner or another, footnotes to Plato. Within Platonic cosmology, we find an inextricable identification between intelligibility and being. Plato conceptualized being in relation to the eternal forms, which were able to give shape to reality, while nothingness, conversely, was associated with disorganized, formless chaos. For Plato, the intelligibility of the world was a matter of its formative composition, and the capacity of intellect, or nous, to apprehend such compositional features through noesis. Form was, therefore, that which distinguished the intelligible from the unintelligible, and also that which distinguished informed being from formless nothingness. In many ways, the core of Langan's CTMU can be seen as an extension and elaboration of this core Platonic insight. Within the CTMU, reality is conceptualized as consisting of two primary domains. The more fundamental domain of reality is what Langan refers to as the non-terminal domain, a notion which is analogous, if not identical, to what I have termed the noetic realm, or pleroma, in keeping with the Neoplatonic tradition. The non-terminal domain, as the name implies, is said to ontologically precede the terminal domain. The latter is understood as the world of sensory observations, including specific measurements performed by scientific instruments. The non-terminal domain, therefore, is understood to be that which ontologically precedes the quantifiable, concrete determinations of the physical world. The terminal, sensory world is thus the consequent activity of a reality which is more fundamentally noetic and teleological. The non-terminal is indeed a world of forms in many ways, but the CTMU distinguishes itself from traditional Platonism in that the CTMU conceptualizes the relationship between the non-terminal and terminal in terms of syntactical and semiotic structures. In other words, the CTMU is a theoretical language within which reality itself is understood to be a process of linguistic articulation. Langan states that the origins of the CTMU began with his readings of Albert Einstein and Bertrand Russell. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Bertrand Russell was at the forefront of a philosophical movement which we could describe as logical atomism, or perhaps more accurately as syntactical ontology. Building upon the developments of set theory and predicate logic, which had been advanced much earlier by figures such as Gottlob Frege, philosophers such as Ludwig Wittgenstein, Alfred North Whitehead, and Bertrand Russell saw the possibility of using such post-Aristotelian formalism to understand the basic structures of reality itself. Despite very similar starting points, ultimately Wittgenstein, Whitehead, and Russell would each diverge into radically different philosophical journeys over the course of their careers. Wittgenstein would abandon the notion that semiotic contents of language could be understood in terms of implicit rules at all, as we see in his text, The Philosophical Investigations. Whitehead would come to conceptualize the structure of the natural world as a mereotopology, or relational matrix, through which space and time arose from the interpenetrations of discrete droplets of experience. Russell, however, would maintain his focus upon logical formalism throughout most of his career, and it was within Russell's work that Chris Langan would come to find the insight that reality itself might be understood as a fundamentally syntactical and semiotic process. As such, the CTMU conceptualizes the distinction between the terminal and non-terminal domains of reality in terms of syntactical substitution rules, which we could visualize as a kind of branching root system. At the lowest level, we have the most concrete, specific terms within the ontological language. These are terms which cannot be broken down any further as they define a moment of time to the greatest degree of specificity which is possible within the language. This bottommost stratum is the terminal domain. When scientific instruments measure a so-called particle, they are detecting one of the discrete terminal moments, which are the basic building blocks of reality. As we move upward through our root system, we are entering into the non-terminal realm. Here we find terms which are more elementary and general, and which can be substituted downward for more composite, particular specifications. Movement down the root system is thus a process of decision-making, by which a moment of conscious activity comes to actualize itself. We can understand such decision-making in Aristotelian terms as formative or top-down causality. The agents which make such decisions are known as syntactors, a term which is analogous to Whitehead's notion of organisms, and the terminal products of the decisions made by syntactors then become the contents of the physical universe, which are available to human sensory perceptions and which are the raw materials of mechanical causation. The terminal operators of the completed event can, in the case of quantum interactions, specify transmissions of factors such as angular momentum, geometrical relations, or energy potentials. The term syntactor must be understood as non-reductive or holonic rather than reductionistic. A syntactor may indeed be a quantum wave state, but all truly self-generative, organismic systems are syntactors within the CTMU. Biological organisms are syntactors, and of course, so are human beings. And so is the global operator descriptor of the cosmos at large, otherwise known as God. Syntactical formative operations are therefore the basic compositional decisions through which the universe as a whole comes to be generated. Here, Langan begins to introduce concepts derived from relativity and quantum field theory. We can imagine each moment of interaction as a point which expands into spacetime as a sphere of potential interactions. The regions outside of these spheres are unavailable due to the speed of light. The spheres expand at the speed of light, as the speed of light is effectively the speed of causality within relativistic spacetime. Overlapping regions between the spheres are regions within which a subsequent interaction event can occur, a moment of re-quantization, which we could otherwise refer to as the collapse of a wave function, or the termination of a syntactor's substitution process. The decisions made by syntactors are not simply arbitrary, but rather they are truly self-determinative, and conditioned by the process of telesis. Teleology is a term which, in classical Hellenistic philosophy, referred to what we might describe as causality or formation. Aristotle described 4 distinct modes of teleology: material, efficient, formative, and final. Material and efficient teleology correlate with what we would today describe as mechanistic or bottom-up causation, while formative and final causation correlate with top-down causality. Over the course of history, the term teleology itself has come to take on a much more specific meaning, and tends to be used to refer specifically to final causality within which an ultimate goal or value acts to shape events by luring organisms towards their realization. A possibility which acts as such a lure can be described within the CTMU as a telic attractor or telon. In order for a potentiality to become a telon, however, it must be evaluated and prioritized by syntactors. Syntactors which can engage in such valuation or telesis are known as telors. The primordial, unrestrained moment of telesis is the self-actualization of the universe itself from its ground state of pure potentiality. Within this utterly unrestrained state, the global operator descriptor of the universe, or God, is able to begin the process of self-generation simply through an a priori meta-syntax. The meta-syntax consists of the formal conditions for the possibility of any syntactical rules at all. As this unbound state begins to transmute itself into a cosmos, the meta-syntax comes to refine itself into more specific syntactical rules, which we might otherwise refer to as the laws of physics. Rather than the laws of physics being purely a priori constants, which are simply given and thus unexplainable in themselves, the CTMU instead understands these laws as the syntactical rules which are generated through a process known as telic recursion. Within the CTMU, telesis, unlike mechanical causation, is understood to occur in a metatemporal manner rather than being conditioned by a linear sequence of events. Telesis is conditioned by the entirety of the past, as well as atemporal forms and potential events which have not yet been actualized. The contents of the terminal domain, that is, the decisions which have already been made, contribute to what possibilities come to be valuated and thus illuminated as telons which can then condition the flow of time as a sort of temporal attraction. Just as gravity lures corporeal bodies through space, telons lure syntactors through time. In other words, the various syntactors which reside within our universe are continually reevaluating the morphological characteristics of their own subjective aims, and the universe as a whole is actively configuring its own compositional elements so as to ensure the continual asymptotic approach of the universe towards its own ultimate aim, the flourishing of existence itself. Within the CTMU, telesis is considered to be the basic substrate of reality. We tend to think of substance as referring to a kind of unformed material which entities are molded from, and thus regarding telic attraction as a kind of substance might seem to be an awkward notion. But here again, Langan's ideas find precedent within Aristotelian metaphysics. Aristotle defined substance as that which preconditions the existence of something else. Due to the fact that material substances may be present or absent, Aristotle concludes that no material can be regarded as ontologically fundamental. Instead, Aristotle concludes that the most ultimate primary substance, or proteiousia, must instead be the unmoved mover, the ultimate final cause, or telon, which animates all of reality. By identifying telesis itself as the proteiousia, the CTMU affirms the ontological primacy of final causation over mechanical causation, but with the additional implication that primary telesis is unbound. The proteiousia can thus be understood as a will unto willing, or the will unto existence, which preconditions all other forms of telesis. Here we can begin to see the full scope of what Langan's CTMU actually is. The description we find in the CTMU of the relationships between syntactors, telons, quantizations, syndiphianesis, and the global operator descriptor is not a description of how our world happens to be, but rather a description of the a priori, logically necessary conditions for the possibility of any reality to exist at all. The CTMU is meant to articulate the most fundamental structures of formal relationships which must be present within any system of logical and, by extension, ontological dynamics. The CTMU describes reality as a kind of self-simulation, that existence itself is the universe's cognition of its own contents. In order for those contents to exist, they must be informed in an intelligible way such that the universe can recursively cognize its own morphology. That self-cognition is being. The CTMU is intended to ascend to a level of generality, which defines the necessary relational structures which condition the possibility of all other languages, including formal languages such as set theory and category theory. This is to say that the CTMU is a metaformal language which describes the basic structure of reality, because that metaformal language, in fact, is the basic structure of any possible reality. The cosmos, according to the CTMU, is itself the expression of a system of formal operations, which is continually generating and defining its own rules. A complete description of an entity within the CTMU meta-language would in fact be the entity itself. The complete CTMU description of your own body, for example, is your own body, as your body, like all other entities in the world, is in fact a complex formal structure which is articulated in the meta-language which is the universe's own basic formalism. The CTMU thus aspires to account for the intelligibility of the universe through being a theoretical language which is in fact identical in its formal structure to the most basic and necessary formal structures of the world. The CTMU, in other words, aspires to define the relations which must be implicit within any intelligible system of formal constructs. Recalling again the Platonic insight that intelligibility is that which differentiates informed existence from formless non-existence, the CTMU therefore simultaneously aspires to describe the conditions for the possibility of actualization itself. It might seem odd to say that the actual entities in the world around us are linguistic expressions, but we must keep in mind here that we are using the notion of language in an extremely general sense. The CTMU understands the existence of an actual event to be the intelligibility of that event as defined by reality's own a priori conditions of intelligibility. In order to be actualized, an event must achieve definition. It must be carved out, as it were, from the space of non-actualized potentialities which it must be defined in relation to. As such, Langan further argues that there can be no pure randomness. The fundamental indeterminacy which we find in the physical world can only be understood as an expression of teleological agency. In order for an event to be fully actualized, all of its parameters must come to achieve concrete definition. The phase spaces or potentiality fields must collapse into determinate decisions. Pure randomness is an incoherent notion, as pure randomness would imply that a given parameter could achieve such determination even without any sort of input which conditions the differentiation of the end result from the myriad of contradictory possibilities which reside alongside it prior to its actualization. Somehow there must be something which differentiates the final determination from its mutually exclusive possibilities, or else such differentiation cannot occur. The universe, in other words, does not, in fact, play dice with quantum events. Rather, the indeterminacy which we find in the quantum realm is indicative of the inherent self-determinacy of all telic operations, the formative and final modes of causality which we previously described as top-down. There are many more nuances of Langan's CTMU which we could delve into here, and I certainly will be doing so in future videos. The way in which his notion of syndifionesis compares with Friedrich Schelling's notion of undifference, for example, or the way in which his notion of noeons compares to Whitehead's notion of conceptual prehensions, or my own use of the term noemata for that matter. Much like Alfred North Whitehead's cosmography, Langan's CTMU can be understood as a type of modern process-relational Neoplatonism, one which centers the notion of formal structures and syntactical operations in a way that we rarely see within other forms of process-relational ontology. There are also many similarities, both obvious and subtle, between the CTMU and the cosmography which I've been piecing together over the lifetime of this channel. But Langan's approach is much more centered upon procedural and formal relationships at a very high level of abstraction, whereas my own work is focused much more heavily upon semiotic dynamics and phenomenology. As such, my work has leaned much more heavily into the German idealist tradition, whereas Langan tends much more towards the Anglo-American analytic tradition. One major point of overlap, however, is the significant influence of figures such as Alfred North Whitehead and Teilhard de Chardin. Langan's CTMU is certainly not the only metaphysical framework which aspires to fill the gaping ontological and epistemological void within modern science. There is, of course, the aforementioned process metaphysics of Alfred North Whitehead, the analytic idealism of figures like Bernardo Kastrup, the holographic theory of Donald Hoffman, and many others. Langan, of course, would argue that although such theories certainly disclose certain pieces of the cosmic puzzle, it is only the CTMU which manages to disclose the most ultimate preconditions of existence. Personally, I remain agnostic about certain aspects of the CTMU, particularly the way in which it conceptualizes the ultimate ontological ground of existence in a highly formalistic and procedural manner, which I suspect might gloss over much more fluid, organismic, and experiential aspects of the cosmos. I'm also rather suspicious of the way that the CTMU seems to recontextualize modern physics while ultimately leaving the prevailing theories of modern physics virtually unscathed. Nonetheless, I can certainly say that the CTMU is by far one of the most ambitious philosophical efforts which has been conducted by any living philosopher. Academic philosophy, for its part, should be utterly humiliated by the fact that its prestigious, gilded halls have failed to produce anything even remotely as compelling or ambitious as the CTMU since the opening decades of the 20th century. In any case, Christopher Langan is also very much capable of speaking for himself, and if you would like more details about the CTMU and Langan's personal story, then I have links in the description box below for his interviews with Kurt Jaimungal, a man who is, unlike Mr. Dave, an actual science journalist who actually carries himself with a sense of dignity. Ultimately, Langan believes that modern science needs the CTMU because modern science needs an ontological grounding which can actually allow it to coherently interpret its own findings. Without such an ontological framework, science is left with no way to consistently understand what its own terms, such as fields, particles, and decoherence events, actually amount to in the real world. By the mid-20th century, modern physics had already extended itself well outside the bounds of what could be rendered intelligible by the mechanistic materialism of the 19th century. Virtually all of the most basic assumptions of such physicalist monism had come to be contradicted by physics itself. During the same time period, physics very well could have entered a phase of self-reflective metamorphosis, during which physics could have begun to seriously reconsider the limits of its own metaphysical horizon, and reevaluate questions regarding the ontological nature of the entities which it was now faced with. This never occurred because it was during this exact same time period that physics came to amputate itself from philosophy as a whole due to the financialization and institutionalization of the discipline, and due to the influence of Karl Popper's anti-metaphysical epistemology. Science does indeed require philosophy if it is ever to find its way out of the corner which it has so gleefully painted itself into over the course of the past 70 years. Mr. Dave's dismissive and juvenile slander is a perfect example of why scientific culture has been not only unwilling but in fact incapable of engaging with its own foundations in a truly meaningful way. Mr. Dave repeatedly takes clips in which Langan speaks using the terminology of the CTMU, claims that these words mean nothing at all, and then concludes that Langan is a nefarious charlatan because he doesn't speak the one and only theoretical language which Dave is actually fluent in. That language is, of course, the physicalist monism of the 19th century, which has been thoroughly outmoded for well over a century now, but which lingers as a zombified vestige within academic culture due to the simple fact that science itself has proven unwilling and unable to move beyond it. During the closing passages of Dave's 77-minute-long middle school temper tantrum, he laments that Chris Langan's CTMU is a symptom of a much bigger problem, that people are losing faith in the science, TM, and that this loss of faith is resulting in an epistemological anarchism, within which people are actually beginning to take seriously ideas which are not spoon-fed to them by academic institutions. It must be truly horrific for the science, of all things, to be faced with the possibility of people thinking for themselves rather than dutifully regurgitating the authorized beliefs which have been approved by the white cloth of academic clergy. However, I'm afraid that I must inform you, Mr. Dave, that this is in fact exactly what is happening, and it is happening precisely because of people like you. Thanks for watching.